Good morning, boys and girls. It is Wednesday, the 27th of January, and today we're going to be reading our final chapter of Georgie's Marvellous Medicine. Okay, we'll be reading the final chapter, and it's called Goodbye, Grandma. Okay, so let's have a wee read of our final chapter now. It's on page, let me just find it, boys and girls. It's on page 92. So, page 92. Oh, sorry, I'm going to read a little bit of it for you, and well, I'm actually going to read it all for you, then I'm going to explain what your task for today is, so you could be following along as I'm reading as well. So, goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be. I give up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in, you'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. That means he looked quite sad and down. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her, and she shouted, "What's going on round here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough it's having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky says. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho, ho," she cried. "Ha, ha! So that's your little game, is it? You'll look after yourself all right, don't you? You'll make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George says. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman, and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height, reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You've not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous." "Everything's George round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hand, and she carried it up high out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," cried the other two. "No, no, no." But it was already too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of Georgie's Marvellous Medicine No. 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring from her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky says. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough. Put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same feeble and furious expression it always had. Her eyes were no bigger now than little keyholes, and they were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you had been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hurry!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you gotten to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Ah, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Cranky, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a brief few moments he had a touch with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. Well, boys and girls, that was an interesting ending to our book. You all were maybe thinking it was going to be a happy ending, but I'll leave you to decide whether you think it's a happy ending or if it's a sad ending. So I'll leave you to make that decision, okay? I'm going to show you now what your task is going to be today. So we are going to be able to use our knowledge of George's Marvellous Medicine to complete a detailed book review, so I can identify the most important parts of the story without spoiling the ending for the readers. I can identify my favourite character and explain why they are my favourite. Okay, so I'm going to show you the book review we're going to do. So if you notice here, it says book review. It's got your name and your date. Now this is going to be on Teacher Made. So it's got book title, and you'll write in Georgie's Marvellous Medicine, and the author, remember, is Roald Dahl. Now our illustrator is Quentin Blake, so that'll go in there, and then you have to tick as many as relate. So we've got fiction or non-fiction. Remember, non-fiction is a fact book and fiction is made up. So we've got fantasy, which is like a kind of made up fairy tale, humour, scary, fairy tale there, adventure, sports, an animal story, a biography, historical or mystery. So you need to decide which one you think it is. Okay, then it's got this part here, the plot, that's the story. You have to write a little mini summary. So for example, I might say about Georgie's Marvellous Medicine, this book is about a young boy called George who has a very unkind and grumpy grandma. George is left in charge of giving grandma her medicine one day, and he decides to try and make a new medicine to make grandma's personality a little bit better. So that would be my summary. I'm not spoiling what's going to happen after it. Okay, the setting, picture of the setting. So where is this set? This is set in Georgie's house. Now I know we don't always see a picture, but I want you to draw a picture of what you think Georgie's house would look like. My favourite character, so you might say Mrs. Cranky's your favourite, Mr. Cranky's your favourite, Grandma, George. You never know, it might even be one of the animals because they're quite funny. The chickens, you might like the chickens, but you have to write why who your favourite character is, or you can draw a picture. And then it says name here, you have to put their name and how you felt about this character and why. And then at the end you're going to do, this book made me feel something because, and then you're going to give it a rating out of 5. Okay, so you're going to do this on Teacher Made. Now it says my book cover. We're not going to put a drawing of a book cover in here. You're going to draw a book cover on a piece of paper or in a jotter or something, okay? So if you have any questions about this, boys and girls, you can email me or you can ask me on Teams. Now this is just a wee fun thing for the end of our book. So I really hope you have enjoyed Georgie's Marvellous Medicine, but I'll be reading your book reviews to see what you think of it, okay? Good luck, boys and girls. And also just to remind you, tomorrow we'll have a Teams meeting. We're doing a Teams meeting at 9:30 and it's to introduce our new book, The Butterfly Lion, but please do not read the book before. Just have your book handy, just like Miss Taylor has. So my Butterfly Lion book is just here. It sits next to me. So you have to have your book handy, just beside you, and you need a piece of paper, a pencil, and maybe a rubber, just in case. And I'll see you on Teams this afternoon for topic at 2 o'clock till 2:30, and then I will see you on Teams tomorrow for our new book. I wanted to do a little Teams meeting so you could all see me and hear me straight away. So good luck with your task. I cannot wait to read what you're thinking about the story, and I will see you all later. Bye, boys and girls.